So Stavros Anastasiou is a recent graduate of Queen's College, New York, with a double major in both classics and Byzantine modern Greek studies. Having a special interest in ancient Greek and Roman literature as well as history, Stavros intends to continue researching the great epics of old and contribute to academia by pursuing a PhD in the future. He is very honored today to present his piece on the concept of justice as commentated by Saint Isaac the Syrian. Stavros, over to you.
Thank you for having me, first and foremost, and I can get started right now. So let's begin. So depictions of war in Homer's Iliad and similar works, including Aeschylus's Oresteia, show that ancient Greek notions of justice emphasize an eye for an eye mentality. This perspective is effectively challenged by contemporaries by commentary from Saint Isaac the Syrian, who writes, quote, "Conquer men by your gentle kindness and make zealous men wonder at your goodness. Put the lover of justice to shame by your compassion. With the afflicted, be afflicted in mind. Love all men, but keep distant from all men," end quote. Justice, according to Saint Isaac, is measured in the context of God rather than traditional Hellenistic demonstrations shown in the epics of old, which were motivated by conflict and glory. Relative to earlier Greek philosophers, this new understanding becomes significant as it marks both a gradual progression away from its vengeful attribute along with tendencies of contextualizing the virtue on the basis of societal institutions. In his article, Historicism in Byzantine Thought and Literature, Greek historian Anthony Kaldelis outlines the interaction between both paganism and Christianity during the early periods of the Middle Ages and its subsequent revival in later years within Byzantium, stating how, quote, "One such transformation that shaped the Byzantine view of the past was, of course, the conversion of the ancient world to Christianity. Whenever one chooses to date it exactly, it marked a clear break not merely in the modes of human worship, but in God's overall plan for the salvation of humanity. This change was as objective, that is, metaphysically rooted in the nature of the universe as could be imagined." While Cadelis identifies a distinction between how both paganism and Christianity contextualize not only man's position within the universe, but the specific values which outline the conditions of such an existence as well, this shift in paradigm allows for new approaches to be applied to pre-existing ancient texts. The moral degradation of characters including Agamemnon and Achilles in Homer's Iliad, and their adherence towards moral boundaries present throughout the war, including conquest as well as supplication, are enough to invite for further interpretations. Using the narrative of the Trojan War as a basis for applying St. Isaac's theology, this presentation will outline how ideas of justice evolved over time, while also considering early interactions between Christianity and paganism. The main question which my research will attempt to answer is how can this theology provide a new perspective for interpreting justice in one of the ancient world's most influential texts. The concept of justice as a whole has been widely explored within the ancient Greek world, being personified and demonstrated in mythology as well as described as a virtue in philosophy. Before the advent of Christianity towards the end of the age of antiquity, justice was rudimentary in both its application and connotation across various forms of literature. Yet one could make the argument that the virtue held some vague association with Zeus. This is demonstrated with the creation myth that describes how Prometheus gifted man fire, as the god of thunder himself expressed his interest in maintaining justice by having the Titan chained to a desolate rock while at the mercy of an eagle. In his paper, Ancient Greek Religion, scholar Hugh Lloyd-Jones notes that, quote, "People learned about the gods and about the justice of Zeus, not from sacred books, but from the poets, notably from the early poets Homer and Hesiod," end quote. Thus, without any central church authority or sacred books to explain a system of ethics, more primitive conceptions of justice would be reflected in earlier works including the Iliad, where conquest and glory are the main driving forces between the actions of its heroes. An example of this dynamic is displayed in Book 6 when the warrior Adrestus supplicates to both Agamemnon and Menelaus, with the former employing what the epic describes as rough justice when he warned his brother not to be swayed by the Trojans' pleas. In Book 18, a dichotomy is outlined in the shield Hephaestus forges for Achilles right before he returns to the battlefield. In the first city, two men are depicted approaching their elders to deliberate over the blood price of the kinsman just murdered, while an army prepares to plunder and sack another town not too far away. This illustrates that the idea that justice is dependent not only in the person who administers it, but defined differently based on the whims of those invoking the virtue itself. This depiction of justice on the basis of glory or vengeance begins to display a form of progression in Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy, where a system of proper crime and punishment is established by the goddess Athena, where a new perspective is given on the basis of evidence, deliberation, and the process of arguments. Even in Homer's Odyssey, a systematic form of crime and retribution is established across the narrative, where justice is no longer invoked on a whim. This is expressed within the opening lines of the epic itself, where Zeus laments the fate of Odysseus' crew in Book 1, and how, quote, "Not even so did he save his companions as much as he wished to, for by their own mad recklessness they were brought to destruction, childish fools. They decided to eat up the cows of the high lord Helios. He then took from the men their days of returning." End quote. During their travels and endeavors of returning home to Ithaca, Odysseus and his remaining crew arrived on the island of the Greek sun god Helios, which is said to be the island of Thrinacia, or modern-day Sicily. Before landing, Odysseus had been warned by both the goddess Circe and the blind prophet Tiresias to not eat any of the cattle in order to avoid any form of retribution. This dynamic establishes a system where punishment was also incurred as a result of either not honoring the gods or offending them greatly. In some instances, however, one may also bear indignation for petty reasons, such as Poseidon's grudge against Odysseus throughout the rest of his expedition after blinding his son Polyphemus. Returning to Aeschylus's Oresteia, what differs greatly between the two pieces are how the gods are characterized in the context of morality and religiosity, with the trilogy depicting them as just entities in thinking, action, and values. A foreshadowing of Agamemnon's death at the hand of his wife Clytemnestra is told by Cassandra, who prophesies how, quote, "If he, Agamemnon, came back home with honor gained from God, if he must now pay for former blood himself by death, and by his death ordain the punishment and death of others too, what man upon hearing this could boast he was himself born free of enmity divine? Since he had gone to Troy and committed bloodshed, the play asserts that he too must forgo his own life, an image of how vengeance can be binding, being further made poignant with the mentioning of a net when Clytemnestra exclaims, how, quote, "How else could I have raised the net of death too high when I was fighting hate with hate?" End quote. Within the final book of the trilogy, the Eumenides, the Furies pursuing Orestes are juxtaposed with the emergence of Athena towards the end of the tragedy, the former representing a decrepit form of vendetta justice compared to a more tempered representation that's on the basis of law. Transitioning now to the 4th century BC, Aristotle defines the essence of the virtue of justice through the establishment of both law and cohesive interest among the people. Utilizing the broader term of virtue or arete, the word initially lacked any connotation to morality or ethics as found in more modern interpretations. Extending to nature itself, the pre-sophist concept of virtue referred to the natural endowments and characteristics of man, which Aristotle himself further contextualizes it to the specific functions of society in its entirety. At this point, an emphasis is placed on the individual and the community as a whole when it comes to justice, leading to greater societal implications not seen before. This shift is even seen with philosophers including Plato, who, according to scholar Hugh Lloyd-Jones, quote, "After the 5th century, philosophy distanced itself more and more from traditional religion. Plato denounced the immorality of the gods as portrayed by Homer and the other poets, revolting against the traditional view that a man proved himself by his ability to benefit his friends and to harm his enemies. He created an ethics that, as the Christian fathers saw, had much in common with that of Christianity," end quote. Plato advocates how justice itself is not concerned with the interests of the strong or the weak, but rather deals with all the other virtues, therefore making it somewhat intrinsically good. It is also dependent on the other 3 virtues, those being wisdom, courage, and moderation. Much like the previous dichotomy of vendetta justice on the basis of war and peace, Aristotle contextualizes the virtue through a dual identification, that being both non-individual or city-state and the individual personal character. Despite this emphasis on social institution and government bodies, justice is elevated with its own significance to the soul. As scholar Florin Crismarenu explains, quote, starting from the three parts of the soul, concupiscence, irascible, and rational, found in Plato, we observe the three virtues, temperance, courage, and wisdom. To these, one may add justice that crowns the other ones. Thus, a metamorphosis of justice as a whole begins to take place. With the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, the main epicenters for Judaism had come under Greek rule. Under this new veil of Hellenism, exchanges with the philosophers was somewhat stagnant, with the Jews being less than eager to borrow from pagan Greek ideas, literature, etc. This dynamic changed with the introduction of the Greek language during the Ptolemaic period, as well as mass conversions to Judaism taking place. When St. Paul had begun preaching to the Greeks, some of his works were said to have been inspired by ideas in Stoicism and Greek thought which were aligned with Christianity, a testament to the interaction between religion and philosophy, which eventually grew in relationship. With regards to St. Isaac the Syrian and his commentaries on justice, he writes in one of his own homilies that, quote, mercy and justice in the same soul is like the man who worships God and idols in the same temple. Mercy is a contradiction with justice. Justice is the return of the equal because it returns to man that which he deserves, and it does not bend to one side, neither in its partial in the retaliation. But mercy is sorrow that is moved by grace and bends to all with sympathy, and it does not return the harm to him which deserves it, although it overfills him who deserves good. And as it is not possible for hay and fire to be able to exist in the same house, the same way it is not possible for justice and mercy to be in the same soul. As the grain of sand cannot be compared with the great amount of gold, the same way God's need for justice cannot be compared with his mercy. Because man's sin, in comparison to the providence and the mercy of God, are like a handful of sand that falls in the sea, and the Creator's mercy cannot be defeated by the wickedness of the creatures, end quote. So unlike the ancient notion of justice, which is exemplified in both Homer and the playwrights, when looking at it through the lens of Christianity, God and the divine are closely associated with the idea of mercy rather than justice itself. In fact, according to researcher Dean N. Kelly, quote, whereas justice has been a very important part of the Judeo-Christian moral tradition, as it is exemplified in the writings of the Old Testament prophets, in the Christian tradition, as well as Byzantine narrative, the idea of justice was supplanted with the addition of the New Testament. In other words, the pursuit of justice isn't intrinsic, but rather an expression of feeling through the religious norm of love or agape. Yet, despite this apparent subversion of the virtue's definition, it wouldn't be wise to say that the metamorphosis of justice experienced a disconnect between ancient Greek and Byzantine thought. As scholar W.B. Stanford states in his article, Christianity in the Classics, quote, for the lover of the classics, the scene in Act 17 when St. Paul appeals to the Athenians at the Areopagus is one of the most dramatic in the Bible. 500 years earlier, Aeschylus had chosen the same site for his Eumenides, the climax of his greatest endeavor to justify the ways of God to man, which was also the noblest and most optimistic effort of the kind in all Greek poetry, end quote. For Aeschylus, the doctrine of justice was one of the highest principles that man could aspire to without the need of revelation. But with Christianity, a new appeal is made in the context of God, which not only considers the desire of justice to be purely a function of moral infrastructure in societies, but emphasizes the need for mercy in a religious life. Referencing Homily 64 of St. Isaac directly, the theologian calls for followers of Christianity to, quote, conquer men by your gentle kindness and make zealous men wonder at your goodness, put the lover of justice to shame by your compassion with the afflicted, be afflicted in mind, love all men but keep distant from all men, end quote. When comparing this conceptualization to the authority the divine holds in ancient texts such as Homer's Iliad, A consistency is shown, where rather based on a whim or good favor, justice is a priority only to those who don't seek the advancement of their own spiritual lives. In an ancient context, while higher values and virtues are utilized in order to contextualize man's relation within his own society, as seen with the warrior Achilles who pursued justice for the sake of immortalization in history, Christianity takes it a step further by emphasizing the interpersonal relationship between God and man and how that affects their position in society and civilization as a whole. Throughout the ancient Greek world, the concept and idea of justice is something that has been contemplated on extensively throughout society, from ancient literature to contemporary philosophy. In the ancient world itself, justice was a concept relatively new that gradually became more and more refined. Evident by ancient literature such as Homer's Iliad and Aeschylus's Oresteia, justice during those times was bounded by a system of revenge and the pursuit of glory. With Orestes, for example, in the situation of killing his mother Clytemnestra, who, for the sake of avenging Agamemnon, his duty to kill her as an avenger was twofold, in that he was also blamed for her murder as well. So based off of these two pieces of literature, ancient Greek conceptualizations of justice was also something divinely inspired by the gods on Mount Olympus, yet the way it was applied was not consistent, but rather on whim and something that was not consistent at all. With Aristotle highlighting that justice is its own entity and is intrinsically good and affects all of society, Christianity makes the assertion that the next step from justice is mercy, which not only affects man's personal relationship with God, but also his relationship with his fellow man. With the purpose of this research, what I wanted to do was to utilize Christian conceptions of justice and apply it into ancient literature. And once that's done, one thing that becomes obvious is that we see that there's a natural progression or metamorphosis as to how justice is contextualized within the time period that it takes place in. And with the use of literature, exchange of philosophical ideas among society, and religious inspiration, the idea of justice has consistently evolved throughout the age of antiquity, and even today holds certain significance when it comes to modern or religious thought or with their contemporaries. So that's the end.